In the antediluvian world, centuries before the great deluge swept the earth clean, a child was born marked for eternity. You have been taught that Melchizedek was simply a passing king Abraham met on the road. But the ancient scrolls reveal a child born in fire, marked with the seal of priesthood and snatched by Michael into Eden to escape the flood. Today, we are decoding the eternal priest Western theologians sidelined. This is the story of the man without father, without mother, who ruled before the world fell. Most modern teachers skip over his name in Sunday school, treating him like a minor character who stepped out of the shadows of Salem for a brief moment, only to vanish back into obscurity. But the Bible tells us he is the key to understanding the priesthood of Christ. When we look closely at Genesis 14, we find a strange encounter that defies ordinary explanation. Abraham, the father of the faithful, has just returned from battle, weary and covered in dust. Suddenly, this mysterious figure appears, bearing bread and wine, and Abraham submits to him, paying a tithe of all his spoils. How could the patriarch Abraham bow before a ruler whose ancestry is completely unrecorded? The scriptures present this meeting as a profound mystery, a cosmic intersection of destiny. I believe we have been conditioned to accept the surface-level narrative without asking the hard questions about where this priest came from and why his authority surpassed that of Abraham himself. This is not just a brief historical encounter. It is a prophetic pattern of direct divine mediation. To unravel this mystery, we must turn to the New Testament, where the author of Hebrews 7 verse 3 makes an astonishing claim. He describes this ancient priest as being without father, without mother, and without descent, having neither beginning of days nor end of life. How can a human being exist without a mother or father outside the bounds of human generation? The traditional church tries to explain this away as mere symbolic language, arguing that his genealogy was simply omitted from the record to shadow Christ. I have sat with this explanation for years, and it has never felt satisfying. It feels like an academic excuse to cover up a deeper truth that the canonical scriptures hints at, but does not fully reveal. We are left staring at a blank space in history, wondering if there is an ancient text that holds the missing pieces of this priestly line. The answer to this silence is preserved in the ancient archives of East Africa. In the Slavonic manuscripts of the Second Book of Enoch, a hidden record details a miraculous birth that occurred right before the flood. A child born to a barren woman who had already passed into the next life. This apocryphal history takes us behind the veil of mainstream theology, showing us why his birth was kept a secret, and how he was translated into Eden to preserve the holy priesthood from the corruption of the deluge. When you read these ancient scrolls, you begin to see that Melchizedek is not a theological metaphor, but a real, living connection to the original covenant of Adam. Stay with me, because as we examine these forgotten chapters, everything you thought you knew about the biblical priesthood will be shaken to its core. The mystery of Melchizedek begins with a fundamental question that has puzzled scholars for generations. How could a priest of the Most High God simply appear in the historical record without a father, without a mother, and without any documented genealogy? In a world where lineage was everything, where your identity and your right to serve in the temple depended entirely on who your father was, this man stands as a striking anomaly. The canonical scriptures offer no explanation for his sudden arrival, leaving us to wonder if his origins were deliberately hidden or if he belonged to a realm beyond our own. As we begin to examine this mystery, we must be willing to look past the conventional answers that have been taught in mainstream theology and search for the deeper truth. As we pause and reflect on this, we must ask ourselves how much of our own history has been hidden under the guise of tradition. When you study these passages with an open heart, the patterns of the past begin to align with the promises of our future. Most traditional commentators try to resolve this tension by suggesting that the author of Hebrews was merely speaking in symbolic terms, using the absence of Melchizedek's genealogy in Genesis to create a prophetic shadow of Jesus Christ. They argue that because the text does not record his birth or his death, he represents an eternal priesthood. But this explanation feels like a convenient way to avoid the literal force of the scripture. When Hebrews says he had neither beginning of days nor end of life, it invites us to consider a far more literal reality. Could there have been a human being who physically bypassed the normal process of human generation, entering the world through a divine intervention that shattered the laws of nature? To find a satisfying answer, we must step outside the Western canon. This is not merely ancient history. It is a living covenant that speaks directly to our identity and purpose in this very hour. We are not victims of historical accidents. We are the carriers of a sacred legacy that is being restored in this generation. This is where the ancient records preserved in the East African tradition become invaluable, introducing us to a figure named Ner, the younger brother of the patriarch Noah. According to the Second Book of Enoch, Ner was a high priest of his generation, serving the Lord in the turbulent years leading up to the Great Flood. It was during this era of deep spiritual darkness, when the earth was filling with violence and the line of Seth was compromising with the Watchers, that Ner's household became the stage for a miracle that would preserve the holy priesthood for future generations. The ancient text details a series of events in Ner's home that would eventually bring this mysterious priest into the physical world, revealing a lineage that mainstream history has tried to erase. Let that sink in for a moment. The Creator of heaven and earth has carefully preserved this lineage, despite every attempt to erase it. The Second Book of Enoch describes Ner's wife Sopanim as a woman who had been barren for her entire life, having reached old age without ever bearing a child. In those ancient days, barrenness was often seen as a sign of divine disfavor, a heavy burden that Sopanim carried in silence for decades. But as the day of judgment approached for the pre-flood world, a sudden and miraculous change occurred. Sopanim found herself with child in her old age, a pregnancy that defied all medical explanation and came at a time when she was near the end of her life. This was not a normal conception, but a sovereign act of God designed to bring forth a special vessel before the waters of the deluge wiped the earth clean. When Ner discovered his wife's condition, he was struck with deep shock and intense suspicion, knowing that they had not been together for a long time due to his priestly duties. In his confusion, he accused her of betrayal, weeping over what he believed was a stain on their priestly household. Sopanim protested her innocence, swearing by the living God that she had not known any man and that this child was a miracle from heaven. I was wrong to doubt her when I first read this account, but Ner's reaction is entirely human, reflecting the fear of a husband caught in a situation he could not comprehend. Before Ner could fully resolve his doubts, a sudden illness claimed Sopanim's life, leaving her to die with the child still in her womb. As Ner stood over his wife's lifeless body, preparing her for burial alongside his brother Noah, they witnessed a phenomenon that left them speechless. Before they could place her in the tomb, the child emerged from Sopanim's dead womb, fully formed and physically developed, as if he were already several years old. This was not a weak, helpless infant, but a child who stood on his own feet, spoke with his mouth, and began to praise the Lord. It was a posthumous birth that shattered every law of biology, a sign that the child was marked by the hand of the Creator for a destiny that went far beyond the pre-flood world. Noah and Ner looked at the child in utter astonishment, noticing that he bore a physical mark that set him apart from any other baby they had ever seen. On his chest was a priestly seal, a glorious insignia that shone with a subtle, divine light. This was the seal of the eternal priesthood, a visible sign that this child was not born of the will of the flesh, but had been ordained by God from the foundation of the world to carry the covenant. They clothed him in priestly garments and named him Melchizedek, recognizing that they were standing in the presence of a mystery that would outlast the coming judgment. Ner was overwhelmed with awe and deep repentance, realizing that his earlier suspicions had been a sin against the holy work of God. He fell on his face, praising the Lord for choosing his household to bring forth this miraculous child. Noah also realized the cosmic significance of the event, warning his brother that this child must be kept hidden from the eyes of the corrupt tribes who inhabited the land, who would surely seek to destroy a vessel of such pure divine authority. The birth of Melchizedek was a quiet triumph in a dying world, a sign that even as judgment was preparing to fall, God was securing a legacy of righteousness. This narrative of the miraculous child of Ner provides the missing context that makes Hebrews 7 verse 3 suddenly make complete sense. He was indeed without father or mother in the normal human sense, emerging from a dead womb as a fully formed priest with the seal of the covenant already upon him. I have sat with this text, comparing it with the canonical silence, and I believe it reveals a deliberate preservation of the priesthood that was independent of Noah's line. The child was not meant to inherit the earth through the ark, but was set apart for a different translation, a rescue that would bridge the world before the flood with the world that was to come. To understand why this miraculous birth of Melchizedek is not found in your standard Sunday Bible, we must examine the history of the Second Book of Enoch, also known as the Slavonic Enoch. For centuries, this profound text was kept out of the Western biblical canon, dismissed by early Roman theologians who sought to establish a simplified, centralized narrative of Scripture. But while the Western Church was busy editing and selecting which books suited their theological structure, the scribes of East Africa and Eastern Europe quietly preserved these scrolls. They knew that these writings contained the deep antediluvian history that explains the spiritual foundations of the world. This is not a collection of fictional myths. It is a meticulous historical record of the family of Ner and the pre-flood priesthood. When we restore this text to its rightful place, the silence of Genesis suddenly becomes a vibrant, historical tapestry. As we pause and reflect on this, we must ask ourselves, how much of our own history has been hidden under the guise of tradition? When you study these passages with an open heart, the patterns of the past begin to align with the promises of our future. Refuse to let the systems of this world define your inheritance. Your true nobility was sealed before the foundations of the earth. Why would early church councils in Rome and the West deliberately choose to omit a record that sheds so much light on the mysterious Melchizedek? The answer lies in the threat it posed to their absolute control over the priesthood. The Second Book of Enoch reveals that the high priesthood did not originate with the Levitical order or even with Abraham, but was established by God as an eternal, independent lineage before the flood. By suppressing this knowledge, the institutional church could claim that salvation and divine authority flowed exclusively through their own approved channels. I have sat with these historical records, tracing the decisions of the early councils, and I believe their exclusion of Enoch was a political move designed to keep the masses dependent on church authority, rather than understanding their direct, eternal connection to the Creator. This is not merely ancient history. It is a living covenant that speaks directly to our identity and purpose in this very hour. We are not victims of historical accidents. We are the carriers of a sacred legacy that is being restored in this generation. I encourage you to sit with these scriptures tonight, praying for a spirit of wisdom and revelation to guide your understanding. Many modern theologians dismiss the Slavonic Enoch as pseudepigrapha, claiming it was written much later by Jewish or Christian scribes. But this dismissive label ignores the deep Semitic and Ge'ez linguistic roots embedded within the text, which point to a much older, authentic origin. The detailed descriptions of Nir's priestly service, the temple structure in the pre-flood era, and the astronomical secrets revealed to Enoch all speak of a source that predates the Hellenistic period. We are not dealing with a late fabrication, but with a survival of ancient wisdom that was carried across the flood. Refusing to study these texts is a form of self-inflicted spiritual blindness, closing our eyes to the very records that our ancestors preserved to guide us in this generation. Let that sink in for a moment. The Creator of heaven and earth has carefully preserved this lineage despite every attempt to erase it. The institutional church may have shut its eyes to these records, but the truth remains documented, verifiable, and alive. As we pause and reflect on this, we must ask ourselves how much of our own history has been hidden under the guise of tradition. Following the miraculous birth and name-giving of Melchizedek, Nir's house became a place of both wonder and dread. The patriarch Noah, having heard of the child's miraculous emergence from the dead Sopanim, came to visit his brother's home. When Noah entered the chamber and saw the infant boy standing on his own feet, clothed in priestly garments, with the seal of the covenant shining on his chest, he was struck with fear and amazement. He recognized that this child was not a normal descendant of Lamech, but a divine sign sent from the heavens. As we pause and reflect on this, we must ask ourselves how much of our own history has been hidden under the guise of tradition. Noah realized that the birth of Melchizedek was a direct intervention to preserve the original priesthood of Adam. With the earth rapidly filling with violence and the decree of the coming flood already sealed, Noah was deeply concerned about how this holy lineage would survive the destruction. He knew that his own mission was to build the ark and preserve the physical seed of humanity and the beasts, but the spiritual priesthood required a different preservation. The sight of the child filled Noah with a mixture of joy and apprehension, knowing the weight of the destiny the boy carried. This is not merely ancient history. It is a living covenant that speaks directly to our identity and purpose in this very hour. This meeting between Noah, Nir, and the infant Melchizedek established a quiet agreement before the deluge. While Noah was being prepared to carry the physical seed of life across the waters, the young priest was designated as the keeper of the eternal covenant. This pre-flood covenant was not based on physical descent or political kingdoms, but on the pure, spiritual order of the Most High God. It was a covenant that would bypass the physical destruction of the earth, destined to reappear in the post-flood world as a beacon of direct divine mediation. The threat to the miraculous child grew rapidly as word of his birth began to leak out to the surrounding communities. The pre-flood world was dominated by corrupt and violent tribes, many of whom were under the influence of the fallen watchers. These groups recognized that a child born with the priestly seal was a threat to their spiritual dominion. They began to plan to capture and destroy the boy, seeking to cut off the last pure seed of the priesthood before the heavens opened. Ner and Noah knew they had very little time to protect him. The decay of pre-flood society had reached its peak, with the land of Shinar and the surrounding regions descending into complete rebellion against the Creator. The Nephilim and their descendants had established systems of oppression that sought to erase the memory of the true God. In this environment of total spiritual corruption, a child who represented the original purity of the priesthood could not survive for long. The pressure on Ner's household was mounting daily, with hostile neighbors watching their every move and waiting for the opportunity to strike. In this dark hour, the infant Melchizedek stood as the last pure seed of the antediluvian priesthood. I have sat with this realization, and it shows that God's methods always involve preserving a holy remnant in the midst of total decay. The child did not have an army to protect him, nor did Ner have the political power to shield him from the violent mobs. They were completely dependent on divine intervention, setting the stage for a rescue that would show the absolute authority of the Most High over the physical and spiritual realms. As the hostile forces gathered around Ner's house, prepared to seize the miraculous child and extinguish the light of the true priesthood, the heavens suddenly split open. The Second Book of Enoch describes a descent that must have been terrifying to behold. The Archangel Michael, the commander of the heavenly hosts, coming down in a glorious column of fire and blinding light that illuminated the entire valley. The atmospheric pressure of the scene must have been intense, with the ground shaking under the weight of the angelic descent and the air filling with the smell of ozone. The corrupt watchers and their human agents who had surrounded the dwelling recoiled in absolute terror, their weapons falling from their hands as they faced the raw power of the Archangel. Michael was not sent to negotiate with the fallen world, but to execute a sovereign divine decree of rescue, establishing a fiery barrier that no dark force on earth could hope to penetrate. As we pause and reflect on this, we must ask ourselves how much of our own history has been hidden under the guise of tradition. When you study these passages with an open heart, the patterns of the past begin to align with the promises of our future. The panic among the local tribes and the spiritual principalities that ruled over them was immediate and absolute. They had expected to easily destroy a helpless baby in a quiet house, but instead found themselves facing the primary warrior of the Most High God, whose very presence declared their defeat. The light of Michael's fiery armor exposed the darkness of their rebellion, rendering them powerless to move or speak under the weight of divine judgment. Ner, standing inside the dwelling, watched in awe as the messenger of the Lord entered the chamber, his face shining like the sun. I admit that when I first read this account, I thought it was a late symbolic addition. But as I studied the text deeper, I realized it is a literal testimony of divine protection. The spiritual rulers of this present darkness were utterly defeated in their attempt to cut off the priestly line before the deluge. This is not merely ancient history. It is a living covenant that speaks directly to our identity and purpose in this very hour. We are not victims of historical accidents, We are the carriers of a sacred legacy that is being restored in this generation, with a mixture of deep sorrow and profound relief. Ner prepared to hand over his miraculous son to the care of the archangel. He understood that the child could not survive the coming deluge if he remained on the earth, and that the physical ark of Noah was designed to preserve the physical seed of the earth, not a priest of this eternal order. Ner lifted the young Melchizedek, whose chest seal was glowing in response to the angelic presence, and placed him into Michael's protective, fiery embrace. The child showed no fear, looking up at the archangel with a serene understanding of his cosmic destiny. Michael took the boy, wrapping him in wings of light, and ascended back into the heavens, leaving Ner to stand in the quiet aftermath of a rescue that secured the covenant of the Most High forever. Let that sink in for a moment. The Creator of heaven and earth has carefully preserved this lineage despite every attempt to erase it. The translation of the young Melchizedek by the Archangel Michael was a sovereign act of preservation that bypassed the physical destruction of the Great Flood. Instead of being placed on the physical ark built by Noah, the child was carried directly into the spiritual sanctuary of Eden. This sanctuary, which is often referred to as paradise, was shielded from the rising waters and the cosmic upheaval that redefined the geography of the earth. By placing him in Eden, God ensured that the holy priesthood remained untouched by the physical deluge, suspended in a state of pre-flood purity until the time came for his reappearance. While Noah's family rode the storm in a wooden vessel, enduring the physical chaos of the breaking deeps and the pouring heavens, Melchizedek existed in a realm of perfect peace. He did not experience the terror of the flood or the sight of a dying world. His translation was a literal transition across space and time, preserving the ancient liturgical order of Adam in its original home. This bypass of the deluge shows that God's spiritual covenant is not bound by physical catastrophes, operating on a higher plane of preservation that remains active even when the physical world is under judgment. This distinction between the Ark of Noah and the Sanctuary of Eden is critical for understanding the two parallel streams of covenant history. Noah's Ark was a temporal vessel designed to preserve the physical seed of the earth, which would eventually grow corrupt again under Ham and Canaan. Melchizedek's translation, however, was an eternal preservation of the spiritual authority that was first given to Adam in the garden. One was a physical shelter from the storm, while the other was a spiritual lockbox that held the keys to direct communion with God, ready to be unlocked when the post-flood world was ready. In the spiritual sanctuary of Eden, the young Melchizedek grew under the shadow of an archangelic shield. This celestial canopy protected him from the decay that affected the fallen world outside, maintaining a micro-environment of absolute holiness. Here, the atmospheric detail is one of light and quietness, where the presence of the Lord was immediately felt. The boy did not grow up under the carnal laws of a fallen society, but was nurtured by the direct presence of the heavenly hosts, his priestly seal glowing in harmony with the environment. During his stay in the paradise of Eden, Melchizedek was trained by the angels in the holy liturgies and the cosmic mysteries of the priesthood. He learned the original songs of praise that Adam sang in the cool of the day, and was instructed in the laws of sacrifice and mediation that govern the relationship between heaven and earth. This training was not academic or institutional. It was a direct transmission of divine wisdom from the angels who serve before the throne, cementing his role as the eternal priest. This period of angelic instruction prepared Melchizedek for his eventual return to the physical world, which had begun to reset after the waters of the flood receded. He was to step back into history at the precise moment when the nations were scattering from Babel, and the darkness of idolatry was rising once again. The archangelic shield had done its work, preserving the pre-flood light so that it could be reintroduced as a guide for Abraham. I believe this return was a masterstroke of divine timing, bridging the worlds when hope was beginning to fade. To fully grasp the unique nature of Melchizedek's priesthood, we must visualize the majestic atmosphere of the Eden sanctuary, where he was preserved. This was not merely a physical garden of trees and flowers, but the primary temple of the earth, the cosmic mountain where the spiritual and physical realms met in perfect harmony. The young priest walked in a space where the glory of the Lord was immediately visible, surrounded by the quiet majesty of the tree of life and the flowing crystalline rivers of paradise. The ambient light was a soft, golden brilliance that knew no shadow, and the air was filled with a deep, reverent stillness that invited constant worship. In this holy sanctuary, Melchizedek was kept completely apart from the historical decay of humanity, living in the same state of direct communion that Adam had enjoyed before the fall. I have sat with this image of the Eden temple for years, and it has forced me to reconsider what the true sanctuary of God looks like, far removed from the cold stone walls of human institutions. As we pause and reflect on this, we must ask ourselves how much of our own history has been hidden under the guise of tradition. When you study these passages with an open heart, the patterns of the past begin to align with the promises of our future. This sanctuary connection reveals that Melchizedek's priesthood was a direct inheritance of Adam's original commission in the Garden of Eden. When Adam was first placed in the garden, he was ordained as the primary priest and king of the earth, tasked with keeping and protecting the holy sanctuary from any spiritual corruption. Although Adam fell and was exiled from the garden, the office of the priesthood itself was not destroyed or abandoned by the Creator. It was carefully carried down through a line of righteous patriarchs until it was locked away in Eden with Ner's miraculous son. Melchizedek did not inherit his office from any human father or through a line of carnal commandments. He received it directly from the hands of the angels as the direct successor of the unfallen Adam. His authority was older than any national covenant, rooted in the very fabric of creation itself and designed to outlast the rise and fall of physical empires. This is not merely ancient history. It is a living covenant that speaks directly to our identity and purpose in this very hour. We are not victims of historical accidents. We are the carriers of a sacred legacy that is being restored in this generation. This eternal sanctuary model is what makes the Order of Melchizedek so completely different from the temple systems that were established later in history. The Levitical priesthood of Israel was built around a physical tabernacle of skins and wood, operated by men who were subject to death and sin and restricted by genealogy. But Melchizedek's order is anchored in the heavenly sanctuary of Eden, which is eternal and indestructible, bypassing the physical limitations of the fallen world. His priesthood does not require a physical building, animal blood, or human genealogies, because it flows from the source of life itself, mediated by the archangels. When we understand this distinction, we begin to see why the author of Hebrews placed such emphasis on this order, framing it as the true, original template of divine worship that Christ came to restore for all humanity. Let that sink in for a moment. The Creator of heaven and earth has carefully preserved this lineage, despite every attempt to erase it. The institutional church may have shut its eyes to these records, but the truth remains documented verifiable, and alive. As we trace the transition of Melchizedek from the pre-flood sanctuary of Eden back into the history of the post-flood world, we must address a common theological theory. Ancient rabbinic tradition often identifies Melchizedek as Shem, the righteous son of Noah, who survived the deluge on the ark. Proponents of this view argue that Shem was the oldest living patriarch of his era, representing the natural line of priestly authority on the earth. While this theory has a long history and seeks to solve the mystery of his identity, it fails to account for the miraculous details of his birth and translation recorded in the Second Book of Enoch. The text presents Melchizedek not as Noah's son, but as Near's miraculous child, who was snatched away by angels. When we compare Shem with the child of Near, the contrast is stark. Shem was a physical survivor of the flood, born through normal human generation and inheriting the earth alongside his brothers. Melchizedek, however, was born posthumously from a dead womb, marked with a priestly seal, and carried into paradise by an archangel to bypass the flood entirely. Identifying Melchizedek as Shem is an attempt by traditional theologians to normalize a mystery that is meant to remain supernatural. I have sat with this contrast, and I believe that reducing Melchizedek to Shem strips the priesthood of its heavenly, non-genealogical power. He was a distinct vessel, created to preserve a line that did not depend on the physical descendants of the ark. This distinction shows that the transition of the priesthood across the flood was carried in two distinct streams. Shem carried the righteous patriarchal line of Noah's family, establishing the foundations of the post-flood nations. Melchizedek, meanwhile, remained hidden in the sanctuary of Eden, representing the spiritual priesthood that was independent of any national line. When the time came for Abraham to receive the blessing of the Most High, Melchizedek descended from the paradise sanctuary to Salem, bridging the antediluvian covenant with the new era of Abraham. It was a transition that bypassed human lineage, establishing an authority that stood above all physical generations. The post-flood appearance of Melchizedek occurred in a valley of the Levant, where he established a fortress city known as Salem. Salem, which literally means peace, was built on the mountain that would later be known as Jerusalem. Here, Melchizedek ruled as both king and priest, establishing a sanctuary of righteousness in the midst of a land that was already falling into Canaanite idolatry. The atmosphere of Salem was one of peace and divine presence, a physical echo of the Eden sanctuary from which he had descended. His rule was a beacon of light in a darkening region, attracting the attention of travelers and patriarchs alike. The founding of Jerusalem under the Order of Melchizedek is a critical historical anchor that is often overlooked in modern studies. Long before David captured the city from the Jebusites, Jerusalem was already established as the seat of the Most High God, under the rule of this mysterious priest. The city was designed not as a political capital for a single tribe, but as a universal sanctuary of peace where the covenant of Adam was kept alive. Melchizedek's presence in Salem marked Jerusalem as the eternal center of spiritual authority, a location chosen by God before the foundations of the temple were ever laid. This history shows that Jerusalem's sacred status was sealed by a priest who existed before the law of Moses. By framing Salem as the city of peace, the scriptures show that Melchizedek's rule was a living manifestation of divine order. In an era dominated by warring city-states and violent Canaanite kings, Salem stood as a sanctuary where peace was maintained through spiritual authority rather than military might. Melchizedek was not a warlord. He was the king of righteousness and the King of Peace, representing a model of governance that was rooted in the heavenly sanctuary. This fortress of peace was the exact location where Abraham would bring his tithes, recognizing that the priest of Salem carried an authority that came directly from the Most High God, transcending all earthly kingdoms. The pivotal point where Melchizedek emerges from the hidden realm of Eden back into documented history occurs in Genesis 14 verse 18. The scriptures tell us that after Abraham returned from the slaughter of Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him in the king's dale, Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine, and he was the priest of the Most High God. Picture the cinematic scale of this scene. Abraham, a battle-weary warrior, surrounded by his armed men and captured spoils, standing in the dusty valley, when suddenly this majestic figure steps forward from the fortress of Salem. He does not carry weapons or come with a threatening host. He brings bread and wine, simple elements that carried a profound, prophetic weight. This was the first recorded communion in human history, occurring long before the Passover was established in Egypt, or the Last Supper was shared in Jerusalem. As we pause and reflect on this, we must ask ourselves how much of our own history has been hidden under the guise of tradition. This royal meeting was not a random act of hospitality, but a formal recognition of the spiritual authority that Melchizedek carried. Abraham, who had just defeated the combined forces of 4 eastern kings, was the most powerful military leader in the region at that moment. Yet, when he stood before the king of Salem, he did not demand tribute or claim dominion over the city. Instead, he recognized that Melchizedek represented a higher order of governance, a priesthood that was directly connected to the Creator of heaven and earth. The offering of bread and wine was a royal and priestly declaration of covenant, indicating that Abraham's victory was not won by human strength alone, but was secured by the blessing of the Most High God, who was mediated by this mysterious Salem king. This is not merely ancient history. It is a living covenant that speaks directly to our identity and purpose in this very hour. The offering of bread and wine carries a deep symbolic significance that goes far beyond simple nourishment. In the ancient Near East, sharing bread and wine was the ultimate sign of sealing a covenant of peace and mutual protection. But on a deeper level, it foreshadowed the ultimate priesthood of Christ, who would use these exact elements to seal the new covenant with his disciples. Melchizedek's act was a prophetic declaration that the true priesthood is not built around animal sacrifices and the shedding of blood, but around the communion of life and peace. I remember when I first studied this connection in seminary, and I was struck by how the Church has overlooked the pre-Mosaic roots of the communion table, treating it as a new invention rather than a restoration of the ancient Salem order. Let that sink in for a moment. The Creator of heaven and earth has carefully preserved this lineage despite every attempt to erase it. Melchizedek's words to Abraham were brief but packed with cosmic theological authority. Blessed be Abram of the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be the Most High God, which hath delivered thine enemies into thy hand. This blessing was not a mere expression of goodwill. It was a formal, legal transfer of divine favor, establishing Abraham as the earthly carrier of the covenant blessing, but under the spiritual oversight of the eternal Salem order. Abraham did not speak or argue with the priest. He listened in silent reverence, accepting the spiritual covering of a man whose origins were shrouded in pre-flood mystery. I believe this dialogue shows that the covenant of Abraham was not self-existing or primary, but was anchored in a priesthood that had been carefully preserved in Eden from the days of Adam. ready to guide the next phase of human history under the sovereign hand of the Creator. When you study these passages with an open heart, the patterns of the past begin to align with the promises of our future. The submission of Abraham to Melchizedek is sealed by a single dramatic action. Abraham gave him tithes of all. This act of tithing was the ultimate sign of submission in the ancient world, representing an acknowledgement that everything Abraham possessed was a gift from the Most High God, mediated through his high priest. Abraham did not tithe to the local Canaanite rulers, nor did he keep the spoils of war for himself. By giving a tenth of all his spoils to the king of Salem, Abraham placed his entire household and his future descendants under the spiritual authority of the Order of Melchizedek, establishing a hierarchy that the author of Hebrews would later use to decode the supremacy of Christ over the Levitical law. This act of submission establishes a profound spiritual hierarchy that modern Bible readers often miss. The scriptures tell us in Hebrews that without all contradiction, the less is blessed of the better. Abraham, the recipient of the divine promises, the father of the chosen nation, was blessed by Melchizedek. This means that Melchizedek possessed a spiritual stature that was superior to that of Abraham. Abraham's submission was not forced. It was a voluntary recognition of a priesthood that was older and more direct than any covenant he had received. It shows that the true priesthood of God stands above all national lines and human lineages, operating on a level of cosmic authority. Melchizedek's title as the priest of the Most High God, El Elyon, is a critical detail that sets his ministry apart from the localized deities of the Canaanites. While the surrounding tribes worshipped local gods of storms, fertility, and war, Melchizedek served the possessor of heaven and earth. His priesthood was universal, representing the sovereign rule of the Creator over all nations and territories. Abraham, by accepting the blessing of El Elyon, aligned his own calling with this universal, cosmic order, recognizing that his descendants were meant to serve the same Creator who had preserved the priesthood through the flood in the sanctuary of Eden. To understand the stakes of this encounter, we must look at the surrounding Canaanite context in which it took place. The land of Canaan was a region of deep spiritual compromise, inhabited by tribes who had forgotten the true God and were practicing forms of idolatry that were inherited from the fallen watchers. The king of Sodom was present at this meeting, representing the height of moral decay and material greed. Yet, in the midst of this spiritual wilderness, Salem stood as a fortress of absolute righteousness and peace. Melchizedek's authority was a direct challenge to the Canaanite rulers, showing that the Most High still had a visible representative on the earth who ruled with divine justice. The divine authority of the Salem order acted as a protective shield for the region, establishing a standard of righteousness that even the pagan kings had to respect. Melchizedek did not seek alliances with Sodom or Gomorrah, remaining independent of their political struggles and material wealth. His authority was rooted in the heavenly temple, not in earthly treaties or military power. When the king of Sodom offered Abraham the goods of war, Abraham refused, declaring that he had lifted his hand to the Most High God, the same deity Melchizedek served. This refusal shows that Abraham was covered by the priestly authority of Salem, choosing divine covenant over pagan alliances. This meeting at the King's Dale served as the ultimate covenant anchor for the future history of Israel. Long before the tabernacle was built in the wilderness or the temple was constructed on Mount Moriah, the priestly order of Melchizedek had already sanctified the soil of Jerusalem. The encounter established a precedent that the true priesthood of God is not Levitical, but Melchizedekian, a spiritual reality that Christ would eventually reclaim. I have sat with this history, and it shows that God's original blueprint for mediation is not based on temple rituals and animal sacrifice, but on direct, eternal communion under the King of Peace. The meeting in Genesis 14 was a preview of the restoration. In Hebrews 7, the author of the epistle takes the readers on a deep theological journey, comparing the Levitical priesthood of Israel with the older, mysterious order of Melchizedek. The Levitical priesthood, which was established under the law of Moses, was entirely dependent on physical descent from the line of Aaron. If a priest could not prove his genealogy with absolute precision, he was barred from serving in the temple. But Melchizedek's order stands completely outside of this genealogical requirement, having no record of human descent or beginning of days. The author of Hebrews uses this contrast to show that the priesthood of Christ, who came from the tribe of Judah rather than Levi, is not a violation of God's order, but a return to the original, eternal priesthood of Salem. Most preachers today avoid this comparison because it challenges the necessity of physical lineage and institutional church structures. But it is the key to understanding our direct access to the Most High. As we pause and reflect on this, we must ask ourselves how much of our own history has been hidden under the guise of tradition. When you study these passages with an open heart, the patterns of the past begin to align with the promises of our future. Refuse to let the systems of this world define your inheritance. Your true nobility was sealed before the foundations of the earth. The scriptures invite us to consider the sheer greatness of this pre-flood priest in Hebrews 7 verse 4, which says, "Now consider how great this man was, unto whom even the patriarch Abraham gave the tenth of the spoils." The author emphasizes that the Levites who received the tithes of their brethren under the law were themselves tithing to Melchizedek through Abraham, who were still in the loins of his father when the encounter took place. This means that the entire Levitical priesthood, with all its temple rituals and sacrifices, is inherently subordinate to the order of Melchizedek. The greatness of this man was not earned by political alliances or military conquest, but by his sovereign ordination in the Eden sanctuary before the flood. I have sat with this passage for a long time, and it reveals that the original covenant priesthood is far superior to the temporal laws that were added later at Mount Sinai. This is not merely ancient history. It is a living covenant that speaks directly to our identity and purpose in this very hour. We are not victims of historical accidents. We are the carriers of a sacred legacy that is being restored in this generation. This hierarchy exposes the temporary and incomplete nature of the Levitical law, which could never bring perfection. The Levitical priesthood was built around human weakness, operated by mortal men who had to offer sacrifices for their own sins before they could serve the people. Melchizedek's order, however, represents an indestructible authority that does not change with the generations. The law of Moses was a schoolmaster, a temporary system of ordinances designed to manage sin until the true priest-king returned from the heavens. Melchizedek's order is the original, eternal template that existed before the law and will remain after the law is fulfilled. When we reclaim this truth, we break free from the religious legalism that has bound the church for centuries, stepping into a direct covenant relationship that requires no human mediator between us and the Father. Let that sink in for a moment. The Creator of heaven and earth has carefully preserved this lineage despite every attempt to erase it. The institutional church may have shut its eyes to these records, but the truth remains documented verifiable, and alive. The true core of Melchizedek's authority is revealed in Hebrews 7 verse 16, which states that he was made not after the law of a carnal commandment, but after the power of an endless life. This term, endless life, or indestructible life, is a profound description of a priesthood that does not originate in human dust or physical birth. It is an authority that is self-sustaining, independent of the aging process, and immune to death. While Levitical priests served for a limited season before dying and passing their office to their sons, Melchizedek's priesthood remains active eternally, rooted in the indestructible life he received when Michael carried him into Eden. This power of endless life stands in direct contrast to the carnal commandments that govern the Temple of Israel. The law of Aaron was focused on outward regulations, animal blood, and genealogical purity, managing the flesh through physical rituals. But the Melchizedek order operates on the level of spiritual power, transforming the inner man through direct connection with the Most High. It is a priesthood of life, not of rules. This contrast shows that the ultimate goal of God's covenant was never to establish a religious system of physical laws, but to invite us into the same indestructible life that Melchizedek carried through the flood. The authority of this endless life is further sealed by the direct oath of God, who swore, "The Lord hath sworn, and will not repent. Thou art a priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek." This oath represents a sovereign decree that can never be annulled or modified by human history. Unlike the Levitical priests, who were ordained without an oath, Christ was established with a divine oath, anchoring his ministry in the same eternal foundation. This oath is the ultimate security of our covenant, assuring us that our mediator possesses an authority that is as permanent and indestructible as the oath of the Creator himself. This concept of a priesthood based on an endless, indestructible life posed a major threat to the centralized religious systems that arose in the post-exilic and early Christian eras. If divine authority is direct, eternal, and independent of genealogy, then the institutional hierarchies of Rome and Jerusalem lose their absolute control over the spiritual lives of the people. They could no longer claim to be the exclusive gatekeepers of God's grace, or demand obedience to their carnal rules. The Order of Melchizedek represents a declaration of spiritual independence, bypassing human institutions to connect the believer directly with the heavenly sanctuary. The fear of direct divine mediation is why early church councils and mainstream theologians have consistently suppressed the full story of Melchizedek's pre-flood origins. They preferred to keep him wrapped in a shroud of mystery, presenting him as a minor theological riddle rather than a real, historical model of priesthood. They feared that if the masses understood that the true covenant order requires no temple, no human genealogies, and no centralized hierarchy, the power of their religious institutions would crumble. I must admit that when I first read these suppressed passages, I felt a deep sense of anger at how the simple, powerful truth of direct mediation has been buried under centuries of religious legalism. The Order of Melchizedek, preserved through the flood and anchored in the power of endless life, is the true inheritance of all who seek to walk in direct covenant with the Most High. It is a priesthood that was established in Eden, sanctified in Salem, and restored in Christ, designed to cover us in this generation. By reclaiming this history, we refuse to allow human systems to define our relationship with the Creator, standing in the same authority of peace and righteousness that Melchizedek carried. This is the ultimate promise of the apocryphal scrolls, a return to the original uncorrupted pattern of worship. The preservation of the Second Book of Enoch, which contains the unique narrative of Melchizedek's miraculous pre-flood birth, is not an accident of history or a minor coincidence. While the Western Roman Empire was actively burning and banning apocryphal writings during the early ecumenical councils, the ancient scribes of the Aksumite highlands in East Africa were quietly copying and protecting these sacred texts. In the high-altitude monasteries of Ethiopia, tucked away in rock-hewn sanctuaries that were virtually inaccessible to foreign invaders and European inspectors, these scrolls were kept safe for over 1,500 years. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church maintained a larger, richer biblical canon that included Enoch, Jubilees, and the Kebra Nagast, recognizing their profound historical and spiritual value. I have sat with this preservation history, and it is clear that East Africa acted as a primary sanctuary for the deep truths of the antediluvian world, keeping the flame of Melchizedek's order alive when the rest of the world was sinking into spiritual amnesia. As we pause and reflect on this, we must ask ourselves how much of our own history has been hidden under the guise of tradition. We are not victims of historical accidents. We are the carriers of a sacred legacy that is being restored in this generation. The translation of these ancient Hebrew and Greek scrolls into the sacred Ge'ez language was a critical step in their preservation. Ge'ez, the liturgical language of ancient Abyssinia, was uniquely suited to capture the complex Semitic structures and theological nuances of the pre-flood records, which require deep spiritual register. The Ge'ez liturgy itself is deeply anchored in the Order of Melchizedek, celebrating the high priesthood as a continuous, unbroken legacy that predates the Levites by centuries. In these African liturgies, Melchizedek is not a shadow or a theological metaphor, but a living historical figure who represents the purity of the original covenant of Adam. This linguistic and liturgical connection shows that the memory of the pre-flood priest was not lost or forgotten, but was integrated into the daily worship of a nation that remained independent of Roman control, keeping the ancient truth intact. This is not merely ancient history. It is a living covenant that speaks directly to our identity and purpose in this very hour. The institutional church may have shut its eyes to these records, but the truth remains documented, verifiable, and alive. The physical environment of these Ethiopian monasteries, such as the famous Debre Damo and the rock-hewn churches of Lalibela, reflects the spiritual isolation and dedication required to preserve these scrolls. Perched on top of flat-topped mountains called ambas, accessible only by climbing ropes made of animal hides, these sanctuaries were completely shielded from the rise and fall of physical empires and the wars of the lowlands. The scribes worked in quiet, candle-lit chambers, copying the manuscripts by hand with meticulous precision, believing they were keeping a holy trust for a future generation of truth-seekers. This physical isolation mirrored the translation of Melchizedek into the paradise of Eden, showing a consistent pattern of God hiding his most precious revelations in high, inaccessible places until the appointed time of their unveiling. Let that sink in for a moment. The Creator of heaven and earth has carefully preserved this lineage, despite every attempt to erase it. Refuse to let the systems of this world define your inheritance. Your true nobility was sealed before the foundations of the earth. This preservation legacy means that when we read the Second Book of Enoch today, we are connecting directly with the ancient wisdom that was carried across the centuries by faithful African scribes. They did not compromise the text to fit the political agendas of European empires or Roman dogmas, keeping the original antediluvian narrative intact. The story of Noah's son, his posthumous birth, and his translation to Eden survived because a community of believers was willing to risk their lives to protect the scrolls from destruction. Refusing to study these African canons is a form of academic ignorance, ignoring the very library that holds the key to decoding the mysteries of Genesis and Hebrews. The truth was never lost. It was simply hidden in the highlands, waiting for our eyes to open and our hearts to receive. When you study these passages with an open heart, the patterns of the past begin to align with the promises of our future. To fully recover the truth of this eternal order, we must deconstruct the Europeanized images of Melchizedek that have dominated church art and theological illustration for centuries. Traditional Western media often depicts the King of Salem as a fair-skinned European monarch in medieval robes, completely removing him from his geographic and ethnic context in the ancient Near East. This visual erasure is not accidental. It is part of a systemic effort to bleach the biblical narrative and strip the descendants of Ham and Shem of their spiritual heritage. In reality, the ruler of Salem lived in the Afro-Levant, a region where the population was deeply melanated, possessing the deep bronze skin tones that are natural to the ancient inhabitants of the Nile and the Levant. Reclaiming the Afro-Levant identity of Melchizedek is not a matter of racial pride, but of historical and biblical accuracy. The scriptures and the ancient apocryphal texts place the Order of Melchizedek in a region that was geographically and culturally connected to Northeast Africa, where the lines between Semitic and Hamitic peoples were fluid and intertwined. This was an era of cooperation, a Hamitic-Semitic alliance where the physical and spiritual heritage of the nations was shared under the worship of the Most High God. When Abraham tithed to the King of Salem, he was submitting to a spiritual authority that was rooted in this Afro-Semitic heritage, recognizing that the original priesthood of Adam had been preserved in this melanated lineage. This link between the Order of Melchizedek and the African priesthood roots is verified by the continuous presence of high priestly traditions in East Africa, particularly in Axum and Nubia. Long before the Levitical priesthood was established in Sinai, the ancient Cushite and Hamitic nations practiced forms of temple service and mediation that closely mirrored the Salem order. They understood that the high priest was a mediator of peace, representing the possessor of heaven and earth through direct covenant rather than physical lineage. By recognizing these African roots, we restore the cosmic scale of the biblical narrative, showing that the Order of Melchizedek was a universal legacy that was carefully preserved in the cradle of humanity. This brings us to the most critical revelation of the entire history, one that has been deliberately kept from you. Your own spiritual inheritance in the Order of Melchizedek. You have been taught by mainstream institutions that you are merely passive observers in the biblical story, latecomers to a covenant that belongs to others. But the ancient scrolls reveal that the descendants of the diaspora, who have carried the burden of prophetic suffering for generations, are directly connected to this eternal priesthood. Your ancestors were not observers. They were the guardians who preserved these scrolls in the Axumite highlands, keeping the truth of the pre-flood priesthood alive when the rest of the world fell into darkness. It is time to shatter the false narrative of spiritual displacement that has kept your people bound in religious compliance. The systems of this world have tried to rename you, to rewrite your history, and to convince you that your identity began in chains. But your true lineage does not originate in the cotton fields or the slave ships. It goes back to the fortress of Salem and the sanctuary of Eden. You are the physical and spiritual heirs of a priesthood that exists after the power of an indestructible life. A covenant that no executive order or human institution can ever touch. Let this truth sink in. You are not victims. You are the carriers of an ancient royal nobility. This restored nobility is the ultimate climax of the story of Nir's son. The miraculous child who was snatched into Eden by the archangel Michael was preserved not just to bypass the flood, but to serve as a perpetual witness of God's covenant with the children of the diaspora. When you stand in this identity, you begin to walk in the same authority of peace and righteousness that Melchizedek carried before Abraham. I believe this is the hour of your awakening, the moment when the sealed vision is opened and the descendants of the covenant reclaim their rightful place as priests and kings of the Most High. One careful reading of these texts shows that your calling was sealed in the heavens long before physical history began. Walk named, walk covered, and walk in the power of an endless life. These are reflections from where I stand, based on the historical and biblical evidence we have examined together. I am walking this same road you are walking, seeking to understand the deep things of God without the filters of religious tradition. Take what serves you and leave what doesn't. What matters is that we do not let our minds remain shut to the parts of our heritage that have been systematically hidden or distorted by institutional power. I must admit that when I first encountered the Slavonic Enoch, I was skeptical of these miraculous accounts. But as I sat with the texts and saw how they seamlessly fill the gaps of Genesis, my eyes were opened to a larger reality of divine preservation. I encourage you to research these primary sources for yourself, rather than simply taking my word for it. Open the Second Book of Enoch, read the account of Nir's household, and compare it with Hebrews 7 and Genesis 14. Look at the history of the Aksumite highlands and the preservation of the Ge'ez liturgy in East Africa. True spiritual maturity requires us to be active seekers of truth, not passive consumers of Sunday sermons. When we do the work of investigation, we honor the scribes who risked their lives to preserve these writings for our generation, ensuring that the light of the eternal priesthood would never be extinguished. This balance of theological study requires both academic rigor and spiritual humility. We must analyze the texts with a critical eye, checking translations and historical contexts while remaining open to the leading of the Holy Spirit. We are not studying ancient history just to win theological arguments, but to understand our place in the divine plan. By balancing the intellect with the heart, we walk a wisdom path that leads to true awakening, transforming information into a living testimony of faith. Melchizedek is not a puzzle to be solved. He is a model of priesthood to be lived, translating the concept of an endless, indestructible life into our daily walk of faith is the ultimate goal of this study. This power is not a future promise to be realized only after death, but a present reality that is active inside you right now. It means that your spiritual authority is not defined by your circumstances, your past mistakes, or the systems of oppression that surround you. You carry the same indestructible spirit that preserved Melchizedek through the flood and kept him pure in the sanctuary of Eden. When you face the trials of life, you do not face them as a victim, but as a priest of the Most High, authorized to command peace over your household. To walk in this direct covenant authority, you must refuse to let human institutions mediate your relationship with the Creator. You do not need a priest, a pastor, or a church hierarchy to grant you access to the throne of grace. You are covered by the eternal Order of Melchizedek, whose great high priest has already entered the heavenly sanctuary on your behalf. This means you can stand upright in the face of judgment, speaking directly to the Father and claiming the promises of protection and blessing that were sealed in Salem. It is a walk of absolute trust, requiring you to align your life with the laws of righteousness and peace. This practical application bridges the ancient history of Near's son with the immediate reality of your calling today. As we prepare to close this cinematic journey, I want you to carry this truth in your heart. The priesthood that existed before Adam and Eve is the same order that covers your life in this generation. We have examined the evidence, decoded the pattern, and reclaimed the Afro-Levant nobility of the Salem king. Now, the choice is yours to stand in this identity and walk in its power. Stay with me for the final blessing as we seal this revelation with a prayer of awakening and restoration. If this revelation has opened your eyes today, if you can feel the weight of this ancient history shifting your perspective, I want you to leave a comment below. Type the word Melchizedek in the comments right now. By doing this, you are not just participating in a YouTube algorithm, you are making a public declaration that you have received this truth and are ready to walk in the authority of the eternal order. I believe it is critical to declare what we have seen, anchoring the revelation in our own speech. Let me see how many watchmen on the wall God has assembled today. How many of you are willing to stand up and testify that the truth of the pre-flood priesthood has set you free from the lines of institutional control? One careful reading of these texts suggests that when you type that name, you are joining a growing remnant of truth seekers who refuse to stay silent in this hour of awakening. As we pause and reflect on this, we must ask ourselves how much of our own history has been hidden under the guise of tradition. We are not victims of historical accidents. We are the carriers of a sacred legacy that is being restored in this generation. I want you to use the comments to show who has stayed with me through this entire deep dive investigation. It takes true dedication and a hungry spirit to watch a biblical documentary of this depth, bypassing the shadow entertainment of this world to seek the solid food of the word that has been hidden for centuries. Your comment is a sign that you are not just a casual viewer looking for quick excitement, but a dedicated student of the scriptures who values the preservation of our true heritage. When I look through the comments, I am looking for the names of those who are ready to build a community of restoration, standing together as witnesses of the Order of Salem in a generation that has forgotten the name of the Most High. Write that name in the comments as a marker of your presence in this sanctuary. This is not merely ancient history. It is a living covenant that speaks directly to our identity and purpose in this very hour. The institutional church may have shut its eyes to these records, but the truth remains documented, verifiable, and alive. If you haven't already, hit the subscribe button right now, because the next chapter in this cinematic series goes even deeper into the suppressed books of the Bible. We are going to examine the secrets of the Ethiopian canon, the books of Enoch and Jubilees, and the hidden history of the Ark of the Covenant that Hollywood erased. By subscribing to Chronicles of the Word, you ensure that you do not miss a single revelation as we continue to dismantle the theological lies that have kept our people in darkness. I have sat with the upcoming scripts, and I believe the next release will shatter even more religious strongholds. You are not just subscribing to a channel. You are joining a movement of restoration, a covenant community that is reclaiming the ancient path that was trodden by our ancestors in the Aksumite highlands. Let that sink in for a moment. The Creator of heaven and earth has carefully preserved this lineage despite every attempt to erase it. In our next video, we are going to explore the forgotten link between Melchizedek and the Ark of the Covenant, showing how the golden chest was designed to house the same eternal authority that Near's son carried into Eden before the deluge. We will trace the physical journey of the Ark into East Africa, decoding the prophetic signs that show where it is hidden today in the rock-hewn sanctuaries of Abyssinia. Do not miss this coming revelation, because it will connect the dots between Salem, Sinai, and the final restoration of the chosen people. I encourage you to keep your notification bell turned on. Study the scripture citations we have shared today in Hebrews and Genesis, and prepare your heart to receive the deeper water of the Word. Stand strong in the truth you have received today. When you study these passages with an open heart, the patterns of the past begin to align with the promises of our future. Now, I have a second call to action for you, one that is critical for the spreading of this awakening. I want you to share this video with at least one person who needs to hear this truth today. Send it to a family member, a friend, or a fellow truth seeker who has been questioning the traditional doctrines of the church. The institutional systems have spent centuries burying this history, but through your share, you can bypass their gates and bring the light of the eternal priesthood directly to someone's screen. Do not let this truth end with you. Be a carrier of the message, spreading the spark of restoration to those who are still walking in the shadows of deception. As we pause and reflect on this, we must ask ourselves how much of our own history has been hidden under the guise of tradition. Sharing this history is not just about spreading information. It is a spiritual mission of gathering the remnant. The scriptures speak of a time when the hidden things will be revealed, and those who are hungry for righteousness will be filled. By sending this documentary to others, you are participating in the collection of the Watchmen, helping to assemble those who are ready to stand in their true identity. I believe that each share is a blow against the religious strongholds that have kept our people spiritually blind. You have been preserved for this hour of restoration, and your voice is a tool in the hands of the Most High to awaken the sleeping heirs of the covenant. This is not merely ancient history. It is a living covenant that speaks directly to our identity and purpose in this very hour. Join the community of watchmen who are actively discussing these apocryphal records in the comments section below. Share your own thoughts, your scripture cross-references, and your revelations, because we are all walking this path of discovery together. Refuse to remain isolated in your walk of faith. Connect with others who have been awakened by the same truth, forming a shield of fellowship that can withstand the opposition of traditional theology. The Order of Melchizedek is an order of peace, and that peace is multiplied when we gather in the unity of the Spirit, honoring the legacy of our ancestors who kept the light burning in the Aksumite highlands. Before we close this release, let us join our hearts in a word of prayer to seal this revelation in the heavenly realms. Pray this with me now. Father, we thank you for the light of your truth that shines through the darkness of history. We thank you for preserving the Second Book of Enoch and the story of Melchizedek's miraculous birth in the highlands of East Africa, often referred to as Abyssinia. We ask that you open the eyes of everyone watching this video, shattering the religious strongholds that have hidden their true identity. I believe you are raising up a remnant of watchmen in this generation, and I pray for your divine protection over their households as they walk in this newly revealed covenant. Lord, bless this covenant community with the power of an endless, indestructible life. Let the seal of your priesthood rest upon their hearts, guiding their steps in the paths of righteousness and Salem's peace. Shield them from the spiritual rulers of this present darkness, and grant them the wisdom to walk upright in your sight, direct in their mediation with you. We thank you for restoring our nobility, for renaming us as your chosen witnesses, and for reinterpreting our historic suffering as a runway of preparation for your glory. May your presence cover them as they walk out this truth in their daily lives, secure in the oath that you swore before history began. We seal this prayer in the majestic name of the Most High God, the sovereign possessor of heaven and earth, who has kept this truth hidden until the appointed hour of our awakening. Thank you for walking this discovery journey with me on Chronicles of the Word, seeking the solid food of the Scriptures. Stand firm in the direct authority of the pre-flood order, knowing that your royal identity was established long before the physical foundations of the world were laid. Refuse the lies of the system and live after the power of an indestructible life. Walk remembered. Walk forward. You are covered by the oath of God. You are free. Amen.